Hello, I'm Maria Hall Brown, and this is LA Currents. In the wake of all the protests and social unrest over the death of George Floyd, Los Angeles promised to make some changes. Well, changes are taking place. As a matter of fact, City Attorney Mike Feuer appointed a new special assistant city attorney in the role of equity director. You might recognize the name. Her father was Larry Aubry, a civil rights leader here in Los Angeles. I'm delighted to be joined by Michael Feuer, the city attorney for Los Angeles, as well as our new equity officer, Heather Aubry. Nice to have you here.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Great. I have to actually start with you because civil rights is in your DNA. I mean, this is something that is, you're part of a legacy family. And first, my condolences over the passing of your father. But your father is very, very well known and very highly regarded in regards to civil rights here in Los Angeles. What was it like being part of that legacy?
It's hard to put into words, actually, Maria. It was very special. I have a difficult time articulating just how special my father was to me and how much it means to me that I am, in a sense, carrying on his legacy. He was so committed to the cause of racial justice, social justice, fairness, and equality for all. He devoted his life to it. He was a columnist for over 30 years, writing for the premier Black publication in Los Angeles, The Sentinel. And so his voice was out there, his presence was out there. So many people knew and loved him. As a child, I would go around with him to various community events, and it's just, I was very fortunate. I treasure those memories, and I intend to carry on in his legacy the best I can.
I'm sure he'd be very, very proud of what you're doing.
Well,
so
thank
congratulations.
you. I appreciate that.
So, Mike, you made this decision to create this position. Obviously, you've worked with Heather for a long time, but how did you envision what this position would be, and what exactly would be an equity officer, and how will she interact with the diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Well, I actually want to speak a little more broadly about Heather's role.
Okay.
As you can tell, Heather is a very special person herself. And in my office, I have a small executive team that leads the 1,000-person office that is the city attorney's office here in Los Angeles. I have one position. It's a position called the special assistant. Now, that position had been occupied by Capri Maddox. Capri, as you know, was recently selected to head a new department in the city, a Department of Civil and Human Rights. So I had a vacancy at the top of our charts. I was conceiving about what that position should be, because special assistant is a role that could mean many different things, playing to the strengths of the occupant of that role and the office's needs as well. In this moment, the office's needs were focused not exclusively but heavily on what it means in this transformative moment to talk about justice and inclusion and equality, both externally in the broader community and internally within our office. I began to hold conversations in our office with members of our staff, including what are called the affinity groups in our office, the Black City Attorneys Association, the Latino lawyers, and so on. And in those conversations, a few things became clear to me. One is that this position of special assistant ought to be the person in our office who is powerfully engaged on civil rights issues more generally, but also somebody who can focus both internally and externally on assuring that the remarkable diversity of our office continues and grows, on assuring that our role in communities throughout the city can continue to be to transform neighborhoods, to assure that every member of our community is lifted up. Then, in one of those conversations within our office, Heather spoke on a variety of issues. And everything sort of clicked for me, that the nature of this role needed to be the person who's the general counsel for our new Department of Civil and Human Rights. That was a proposal made, actually, by a group of women lawyers in my office who were making recommendations about what the future of this position ought to look like. Thought a lot about our role in the broader community and about the things that Heather said that were so poignant to me. All came together. So here now we have a role where internally and externally, Heather is going to be a continuing champion for values that are deeply important to me. Fortunately, they're not new values for our office. We need to take things to the next level. You know, more than half of our staff is comprised of people of color. More than half of our staff is female. Nearly half of our lawyers are people of color. Those are important statistics, but the statistics just begin to scratch the surface. There's much more we could be doing. And qualitatively and quantitatively, that's going to be a role for Heather to lead. No pressure, Heather, really.
No, I was going to say, and hearing, you know, what Mike is saying to you, I'm not sure how much he's actually said that to you, you know, personally, but it's fascinating to probably hear the perspective that he has as to why you were chosen for this position. So how do you feel about this? What are you hoping to do, and how do you see your special assistant position reaching out to this Department of Civil and Human Rights, and how those bridges can be created and the kind of dynamism that can happen within the city because of this new initiative?
I see my role as absolutely embodying the importance of equity, not just as a catchphrase or as a concept, but actually implementing it and making it concrete. So internally within the office, spearheading initiatives, collecting data, finding out where we are, listening first and foremost to those in the office and their perspectives on my role, because I would like to hear their input on that and what guidance I can take from them about how they see the role, because there are so many within the office that the entire office, in a way, has a stake in this. It's not just me. It's not just the leader of the office, Mike Feuer. It's all of us. So it's essential to bridge the divides that still, to some extent, plague society. You know, broadly and within the office, to some extent, there are those that feel that it's important to have a deeper conversation, and I'm happy to be a part of that. I want to be a part of that. And in terms of the role of advising the new department, I'm very excited about that as well, on human rights and civil rights. That department will be at the forefront of a lot of very important conversations and issues around discrimination and racial equity in the city. So I look forward to implementing the initiatives that come out of the equity position.
From practical terms, what happens? I mean, will this influence the kind of cases the city attorney's office takes? Will these conversations influence what kind of areas that you support, get the word out on? I mean, what are the brass tacks of this? What does this actually mean?
You know, it's a really good question, and the answer to much of what you've asked is yes.
Okay.
For example, Heather, in the conversation I was referring to, made a point of emphasizing the significance of continuing to look outward into our community and broader society on the very issues you're talking about. What stances should our office be taking? We take many, as you know, on all the issues of our day, but should we be doing more? What legal cases in the Supreme Court and elsewhere, whether we're a party or not, should we be involved with? What kinds of legislative advocacy should we be engaged in? We're doing these things now, but to say that we're doing them is not to say that we're doing them as well or as extensively or as broadly or as deeply as we can. And that's part of this job. You know, we're in a city that claims to be the most diverse place in the world. We may be diverse, but we're a highly segregated city at the same time. And one of the things that I really admire about Heather is that Heather is a very direct person who likes to take on issues head on. We're not going to shirk from responsibility. We're not going to try to brush anything under the rug. We're going to be trying to identify the issues in their most direct and candid way and take them on. Internally, I've been leading conversations, and I was in a conversation with a number of lawyers in our office, and people were expressing their views about some of the racial justice issues of the day. And I stopped and I said, you know what, I don't think everyone's being candid enough. Let's start this all over again. And I recognize that in so doing, that's inviting a critique of the status quo, of where we are. That's how we get better. If we're not prepared to look ourselves in the eye and truly evaluate whether we're doing all we can to advance causes that are kind of catchphrases today. Racial justice, social equity, inclusiveness. Those are important words, but they don't have much value unless there's action to back them up. And the reason I chose Heather for this job is she's a lawyer and a leader of action. And so we're looking to try to identify with some specificity, and I'll give you a couple examples what that means. Let's take something as basic as the hiring in our office. As I mentioned, we have a very diverse office, but I'll give you a couple statistics that lead one to identify some of the challenges. I met with our Latino lawyers. One of our leaders in that group said, you know, Mike, 17% of the lawyers in our office are Latino. And I was thinking to myself, yes, and 48% of our city is Latino. Well, 4% and change of the California bar is Latino. So you could look at the statistics, just at the numbers, and say, okay, well, we are 400% more represented among Latino lawyers than the state bar is. Or you could say that we're like 35% of what the city's population looks like. If you choose one statistic, you could get complacent. If you choose the other, it's a call to action. So those are the kinds of issues. Again, that's a very basic one. There are deeper ones too, about how in Los Angeles today, we identify, because there are conflicts, you know, how we can truly inculcate respect and understanding among people. And then what programs ought to be implemented right now, as opposed to only a discussion. That's the work of our office. It's a leadership role. Heather's a leadership person.
I must know what you said that spurred this response. I mean, what were the concerns that you brought to the table that made Mike realize that you are the person for this job? You obviously have a civil rights background. You have a long legacy, not just from your family, but in terms of your own career, in being a woman of color who has been very in the forefront in her legal career. What was it you said? What is it that you want out of this? What is it that you know we need to change and do in order to move forward?
Not to speak for Mike, myself, because I'm not sure exactly what resonated so much with him, but I will say that I just spoke from the heart. It was a meeting with the Black City Attorneys Association board, and I, in part because of how deeply I feel my father's loss, how keenly I feel that, and the loss to the wider Los Angeles community, I think I expressed myself emotionally but passionately about my own deeply held beliefs. I did specifically mention how the office could reach out more in terms of, or be more out there in terms of, for instance, providing amicus support around issues that the office already has taken a leadership role in terms of LGBTQ and immigration-related issues. There may well be, and I suspect there will be, more opportunities in the area of racial justice and other marginalized groups, and being able to have our voice as an office heard in those kinds of cases at the Supreme Court. Certainly there are legislative possibilities that we could inject ourselves into when appropriate, and I believe I mentioned that as well. So I certainly am very committed to staying engaged with the wider community. I always enjoyed, as an attorney, going out to schools, for instance, in South Los Angeles, where I grew up, and being able to relate to those kids, not as someone coming from the outside and talking to them about how they can come over to my side and, you know, sort of the promised land. It's not about that. It's about telling them, I'm one of you. I came from this very same place, and there's no shame in being from this place, and there's so many good people and so much that we've already accomplished and can continue to accomplish in this community. It's not about just leaving the community, but we can have an impact in the wider community. And so I always enjoy that. I look forward to continuing to do those kinds of things.
I know you've talked about the power of mentorship, and this isn't specific to the role that you now have at the city attorney's office, but who was your mentor? I mean, you know, you speak to these young women about they have the power, the control, and the ability to fulfill their dreams, as you did, and the power of mentorship. So Beyond your father, who did you look to? Who did you see that demonstrated to you as a young woman that you can do what you want to do with your life?
That's very interesting. It may seem like an obvious question I should have anticipated, but I think so much about my father and how he's influenced me, but there are certainly others in my life. My own mother, she was not an activist per se, is not, but just her values, her deeply held values of caring and the value of not being just about yourself, being an individual, but the wider society.
Right.
The individualistic values just really didn't have any place in my home, both from my father and my mother. Growing up, just a lot of teachers are crossing my memory. In my memory, there's so many. Even my kindergarten teacher.
You never know who's going to cross your path.
You never know. And she ended up coming to my law school graduation. She somehow managed to follow the course of my life. I had stayed in touch with her briefly. Just a wonderful woman, Mrs. Dixon.
Wow.
And she came to my law school graduation. My sister, I admire her greatly. She's a writer and published a couple of books, and I just think she's a great role model.
Well, and it's fascinating to think about, how your example is going to reflect in the eyes of young women, coming up behind you.
Right.
And your office has gone through a lot of changes. You've put her in a position of new authority a couple times now. So what prompted you to make the decision about when you had a cannabis
Yes.
department and all those things? There must be something there too that she can do new things well.
Well, this is the thing, because it would be easy in this conversation to focus on a particular discussion, but of course I chose Heather because of what I know of her work as an accumulation of many things. Heather is a person who's extremely sharp. She has a very eclectic background in our office. She's been a prosecutor, she's been an advisor, she's been a leader on a whole array of issues. She's done key oral arguments, and as you mentioned, she most recently has been the top advisor on issues of cannabis regulation in a state where those were top of mind issues, right? So Heather, I think, has about 25 years of experience in our office. You look at Heather and you think, how could that possibly be? But it's true. So just to be real about it, while some of the things that Heather recently said deeply resonated with me on a personal level, as a professional in our office, I've known about Heather's great skill and attributes for many years, which is why she's continued to ascend, including since I've been city attorney, in the office. I do want to say, I was earlier giving an example that's kind of a basic one for our viewers, and that is, how to deal with issues of recruitment and retention in the office, assuring a diverse workforce that is culturally competent and that reflects the diversity of our city. There are many more deep and substantive issues that we're grappling with now.
I was going to ask.
And some of them are issues that Heather's going to be in charge of, and some she will touch on because others are working on. I was just talking today, for example, with the leader of our criminal branch in our office about criminal justice reform issues. Our office is one of the leaders in the country in identifying the most effective ways to grapple with people, often youthful, first-time offenders. We have pioneered, in many respects, key programs that engage members of the communities where offenses occur with offenders for whom it might be, again, a first offense, where we can change the trajectory of that person's life and make the community safer because we're reducing recidivism, repeat offenses. We have a whole slew of programs that are thematically tied to those basic principles. The leader of our criminal branch and I just sent an email out to our staff discussing a whole series of work groups that we're creating. Notwithstanding the fact that we're one of the leaders in the nation in criminal justice reform, we can do more. And already several dozen members of our staff have, just in the course of the last 20 hours or so, volunteered to actively participate, in addition to their regular work, in further shaping how we can, as a prosecutor's office, intervene and shape the system, change people's lives for the better, and make our neighborhood safer, all at the same time.
How much control do you have in a preventative nature? I mean, you're talking about the criminal justice system, which leads to numerous problems, but sometimes addiction is the gate that leads someone into the justice system. Sometimes it's small crimes, as you mentioned. What prevention prospects do you have as the city attorney's office, and how can that fit into this diversity, equity, and inclusion campaign?
Let's take something, again, kind of gritty. Let's talk about human trafficking.
Oh, yeah.
So we have some marvelous programs that tackle the issue of what has been traditionally called prostitution. But more recently, we've all come to the recognition that many, many sex workers came into this as victims of human trafficking, right? So we have multiple programs, again, one of the leaders in the country on this issue, where we take somebody often who has been through the system and she's been chewed up and spit out 3 or 4 times by the justice system with no benefit to anybody. And here she is, she's victim of violence, there are drugs may be involved, a lot of coercion. And we say, look, we're gonna offer you housing and counseling and job training, and we're gonna see if we can dramatically alter the trajectory of your life.
And your office has that power.
We are deep, yes, and we coordinate with social services providers and others. And see, there are many points of nexus here, though, because by far the lion's share of sex workers who are referred to our office by police and arrests and so forth are women of color, vast majority. And we've had some very serious conversations in our office, including with the police department, about the inputs into our office. You know, for example, long before the George Floyd murder, we engaged in a serious analysis of our statistics when it comes to prosecution. Are we, for example, prosecuting white suspects, African American, Latino, Asian American suspects? Are we prosecuting people at the same rates, more or less? And the answer is yes. In other words, there's no systemic bias in our office in terms of we're prosecuting a disproportionate number of people who are African American or Latino, whatever it is. But it's also the case when it comes to, say, sex workers, that the majority of referrals to our office are women of color. So the percentages by which we prosecute reflect an objective approach. But the inputs into our office reflect the lion's share coming from communities and are women of color. So how do we contend with that, those inputs? These are the most basic issues in the criminal justice system today. It's not just what kinds of sentences you impose or even the methods of prosecution you employ. It's what does the system look like and who's coming into it? So you say, how can we be involved in prevention? And I'll turn to Heather, but Heather mentioned, for example, the idea of being in communities and being a role model. We have some programs, I've engaged in them, others have too, where we're in schools, for example, very early on in kids' development, middle school students, for example, trying to influence them at a stage when they're responsible enough to start to take some action, accountability and so forth. How do we focus on their futures and what they can look like as they grow up? What potential can they unlock? We can do all these things. It's tough, though, because we have limited resources. The pandemic has caused the cratering of our economy, and so our budget, in our my city attorney's budget, we have to cut 18.6% of our personnel time in this year, just as the demands on our time are greater than ever.
Well, and all we know, the domino of what's going to happen in the court system, et cetera.
That's right. But I'm confident that under Heather's leadership, we can accomplish a lot.
All right. Well, then, let's just dream here for a second, because there are restrictions, there are issues that we're dealing with in this moment in time. But if all of those were gone and you could dream about what this would look like in a year or 2 years from now, what do you hope you can do? Or what do you dream you can do? Not money, not the problems that we are having with this virus, but I'm sure you know what you want. So if you could have it, what would it look like?
It would be a little short on real specifics right now because I need more
worry.
time to think all that through, but I will say that as a...
He's not writing anything down.
Yeah, that's right.
Realizing that in the role that I'll be in, that I can't change the world per se, I would very much like to think that within the office and externally, I can be a major contributor to change. And having that change start as early as possible, not just, I'm speaking elementary school level, just returning to that concept of starting early and through middle school and high school and the pipeline. I think it's just essential for young people to realize that their lives are worth so much more than they may have been led to believe. Just there have been systemic issues of racism, sexism, discrimination against so many groups, the disabled, LGBTQ. Everyone needs to understand their value, their inherent worth from as young an age as possible. And I think there are just so many different ways to help implement and effectuate policies and programs that help instill that in people from a very early age. And in terms of the legal profession and what we can do internally, I absolutely intend to grapple with the issues that will be brought to my attention by the various stakeholders and voices in our office. So I don't want to put words in their mouth right now about what are their top priorities, but I look forward greatly to taking all of that in. And if resources weren't an issue, then that would be fantastic. I could implement as much of that as possible in the time that I have to do it.
And, I do want to say, you said something a moment ago that stuck with me. You asked Heather, basically, let's dream big. Mm-hmm. That is, in fact, our charge. And we can do stuff. When I ran to be city attorney, which was a little more than 7 years ago now, I said my aspiration was to have the LA City Attorney's Office be the best public law office in the country. And 4 years later, the American Bar Association gave its top award in the United States. They give one award every year to a public sector law firm, and they gave it to our office. We have the potential within our office to be a major force for good in our city. I hope we fulfill that potential every day. But there is a great deal more we can do. And when it comes to issues, that as lawyers, we are uniquely situated, right? Because when it comes to civil rights, many of those issues play out in the justice system, in the criminal courts. They also play out in constitutional practice before the Supreme Court. They also can play out in state houses, including in Sacramento, where I once served. They can play out in City Hall. Heather is pointing out they also play out every day on the streets of, again, a very segregated city where there is an enormous gap between rich and poor, an enormous gap between the fulfillment of potential among kids of color on the one hand and white kids on the other, especially when it comes to class and when it combines with race. There are major issues before us. If we don't contend with those issues of basic equity in our city, we are not going to succeed as a society. We as lawyers, we in the city attorney's office, we with Heather's leadership have the potential to do great things. And again, some of them are going to sound kind of prosaic. How do we assure that our office reflects the diversity of our city? How do we assure our staff is getting appropriate trainings on everything from implicit bias to how to be culturally competent? And some of it reflects great vision, potentially, sweeping changes in how we administer justice in the criminal courts, and how we engage with neighborhoods. At the end of the day, most people in LA, in every city, care what's happening on their block. How do we engage in neighborhoods so that every kid can feel proud of what's happening on his or her block? I heard Heather today in this interview talking about kids who may not have been told growing up that they're worth very much. I remember when I was a candidate for city attorney, and I was in a neighborhood, happened to be in South Los Angeles, and the street I was on had almost every problem in urban America you could identify in about a block and a half. And I remember saying to the person I was talking to, if you were a kid walking down this street right now to school, because it was a pathway to a school, mm-hmm. you would think nobody gives a darn about me, about my community or about me personally, and you question your worth.
Right.
That's not right. In many ways, that's at bottom what this work is about having, through the actions we engage in, whether it be in court or on the street, making sure that kids know how deeply valued they can be.
Right. Forgive me, I'm going to say something that your father said. A soldier never gives up, he just changes position. So congratulations on your new position.
Thank you so much,
Right.
Maria.
Thank you so much, Mike, and congratulations. I look forward to hearing from you. I'll give you some time. Let's get a settle in.
I'd be happy to return. Thank you.
We'll be back in about 5 minutes, Maria.
There you got it.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks. And that's a wrap on this LA Currents.